Hi class, today we're going to be looking at cell internal organization. This is chapter 4, section 2. And these are your 5 questions we're going to be looking at today to make sure that you're understanding what the key concepts are. The first question, explain the difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. We have talked about this a little bit in the past, but we'll add to that a little bit here. Prokaryotic cells are kind of the initial type of cells. Scientists believe that these were the first types of cells that started life. Prokaryotic cells are single-celled organisms that bacteria, they live in extreme environments, things like that. So we'll get into that a little bit. And then eukaryotic cells are what we're made of, the type of cells that we would call true cells. The EU, means true. And then we'd be looking at cells that have a nucleus and have complexity to them. Number 2, what 3 things do all eukaryotic cells have? We'll get into that in the first couple slides of our notes. What is meant by selectively permeable when talking about the cell membrane? And this is a key thing that we're going to get into slightly in this chapter, but we're really going to cover it in chapter 5. We'll just talk about it a little bit here, and then we're going to look at how the function actually happens in chapter 5. And then number 4, describe the parts of the cell membrane, which the cell membrane is made of a phospholipid bilayer. And the key word there is lipid. It's a fatty layer around the cells. We'll get into the parts of that. And then the 5th question here, define organelles. Okay, so our notes today start with internal organization and a comparison of prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. We'll do a little chart here. Prokaryotic cells are considered before nucleus. That's kind of what the word actually means. So there's no nucleus and there's no membrane-bound organelles. Now currently you don't necessarily have a definition of what an organelle is. You would have done this maybe back in 6th, 7th grade, something like that. Organelles are all the little things, they're like mini organs that function inside the cell. Things like a mitochondria or a chloroplast or an endoplasmic reticulum, and some of those I think you would have covered in past grades. So a prokaryotic cell does not have these membrane-bound organelles, and they are generally always single-cell organisms. They're very simple, they're usually bacteria, and they usually live in extreme environments. Eukaryotic cells mean true nucleus, and there is a nucleus. There are membrane-bound organelles. These are considered more complex if we're looking at the actual full cell. And these would be some single-celled organisms. There are still some bacteria that are eukaryotic cells. There are some other things that are single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic. But multicellular organisms are all made up of eukaryotic cells. The key thing here is that both prokaryotic and eukaryotic do have DNA. In eukaryotic cells, the DNA is inside the nucleus, but in prokaryotic cells, the DNA is just kind of floating inside of the cell. Okay, so the 3 things that all eukaryotic cells have: they have a cell membrane, which we're going to get into a little more in a couple slides, but also in chapter 5. And this cell membrane is very important to help maintain homeostasis inside of a cell. So there's that big word again, homeostasis. And as a reminder, homeostasis means a stable internal environment. It is a key word you're going to have to know. If you haven't learned it yet, you need to learn it. Number 2 is a nucleus. All eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and that nucleus will hold the DNA. It's kind of our brain of each cell. It's the control center of each cell. And then number 3 is other organelles, and these organelles are called membrane-bound organelles. And by membrane-bound, that's not actually like some complex thing. It's just that it has little cell membranes kind of around these organelles. And they have individual functions, and each one works kind of like our body uses organs to do specific functions and work to complete the body. These organelles have specific functions and work to complete the functions of the cell. Today we're going to be looking at the cell membrane and the nucleus, and then tomorrow we'll be looking at the organelles. So parts of the eukaryotic cell, you can see here, we have some individual parts that you can see: the nucleus, the chromosomes, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, and microtubules. mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, centrioles, and cilia. Now, some of these we're going to spend time on tomorrow's notes looking at the specifics about each of them. And some of them we don't spend as much time on. The key part here is structures of the cell are determined by the functions of each part. So each of those little organelles look a little different from each other because they have specific functions inside the cell. Okay, so first we're going to get into the cell membrane. And you could fill out your little chart for this. I have one of those. If you haven't seen that, you can get one from me. But you could just make a chart if you don't have one. But the cell membrane, the function is the outer layer of a cell. And it lets things into and out of the cell. But it is somewhat selective. It doesn't let everything into and out of the cell. And that's where we get into the idea of being selectively permeable. And we're going to get into this a lot more in Chapter 5, but certain things can pass through the cell membrane on their own without needing help, and then some things are just too big. Some molecules are just too big, and they have to pass through getting help. They just can't pass through on their own because they're just too large. This is kind of an idea of what our cell membrane would look like, and this is called a phospholipid bilayer. And to kind of show what the different parts are, we have here integral proteins, and that's here where they go all the way through the cell membrane. We have peripheral proteins that just sit on the outside, and then we have these lipids. So this is an example of the lipids, and you have the hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends. So the two ends right here of the lipid, like we looked at last chapter. If you want to draw a little something in, you can. Hydrophobic tail and our hydrophilic head. Okay. There's also a couple other things that are attached. You can see this carbohydrate. That's these little things that are attached here. And they kind of help, they're almost like little enzymes. They kind of help the processes happen along the cell membrane. So parts of the membrane, we have membrane lipids. Okay, and I just mentioned this, the phospholipids, they're arranged due to their hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends, so those words show up again. As a reminder, hydrophobic means water-fearing and hydrophilic means water-loving. It is called a lipid bilayer, and these steroids or cholesterols are embedded within, and that's kind of what we were looking at on that other slide. So here's what it looks like. You can see a hydrophilic head. It's just kind of a big ball, and then we have our chains here of the hydrophilic tail, and there's usually just two tails per head, kind of. Okay, continuing parts of the membrane, we have membrane proteins. We just showed these in the picture. We have peripheral proteins, which sit on either side of the membrane. Peripheral is like on the outsides, and that would be indicated in this purple protein and this green protein. And then we have integral proteins, and those are embedded. They go all the way through. And so like this one here, it goes all the way through. And will allow, it's going to be useful, we'll see that in Chapter 5, but it's going to allow things to go across the membrane here. It's almost like a little channel. It'll allow things to go back and forth across the membrane. Okay, and here's kind of what that membrane looks like again, just another image of it. There is a term for the cell membrane. It's called a fluid mosaic model, and it says the membrane will behave like a liquid. It's not a solid. It's not like those proteins have to stay in this one position. If you were to take an image of the fluid or of the cell membrane at any one moment, this protein can move. It can move maybe from there, and it'll look like the next time it'll be here. And so the idea that the membrane is more like a fluid in that things can move around inside there. They're not stuck. And mosaic just means a changing pattern, so they can kind of move around and look different every time you look at that particular membrane. Okay, organelles are called mini organs of the cell. And each organelle will have its own structure and function, and that's a key part. They have their own structure and function, and you're going to have to learn those. We'll have a little chart you can fill out to help you do that. All of these cells have different types and numbers of organelles. So for example, if you are looking at a muscle cell, there's going to be a lot of mitochondria in that particular cell. Whereas if you were looking at a kidney cell, you might see a lot of lysosomes. So it just depends on which type of cell it is based on how many organelles it will have of that particular type, based on its function. So if it needs to clean out lots of stuff, then it's going to have more of the lysosomes and peroxisomes that help clean out toxins and things like that. Okay, the one organelle we're going to look at today is the nucleus. So the nucleus's function is to store hereditary information. So basically it just keeps our DNA. It's a control center. It controls what functions happen in the particular cell. You can see here in these pictures, these are the nuclei inside of each cell, and they're darkened. When we do our lab, you'll be able to see those pretty well in the plant cells and in the animal cells. And here's some things that the nucleus contains: a nuclear envelope, nuclear pore, nucleolus, and chromatin. Chromatin is just chromosomes here. So chromatin, it's just chromosomes, it's just in a different form, and we'll talk about that in chapter 10. So you can get an idea of what the nucleus looks like. And that's where we're going to end today. We'll be looking at the individual organelles, many of the others, about 12 of them, in tomorrow's notes.